6 drivers out, challenging conditions and strategy errors. This week we're chatting all about the Australian Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Saira, and this week F1 had their season header out in Albert Park in Australia, and it was a busy race weekend. It was going to be the first weekend we actually got to see what these cars looked like in race trim, because in testing you can never really tell what's going on there, so we got to have a proper look at what was going on with each of the teams and where they might be. But even then, and looking at the results from this race weekend, we still have to take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because race day had rain, which I don't think beforehand we had been expecting in Australia, but in the run-up we knew where the forecast was predicting it. But also Albert Park is a bit of a weird track. It's a street circuit as well, and it's only one track on a 24 race calendar. There's a lot going on this season, so just because a team does well here or doesn't do well here doesn't mean that that is going to be what happens for the rest of the season. But it was really good to have racing actually start back. Proper racing, not just testing. But let's get into the actual race weekend. And I don't think there was actually any huge news coming into this race week, except for the fact that Stefano Domenicali is staying on as the CEO of Formula One. That was kind of the big headline. He's sticking around. I hadn't heard whispers that he was going to leave, so it's not a surprise. But yes, that was only the really big piece of news that we had come out. But the interesting stuff obviously happens on track, and let's get through qualifying because it was an interesting one. Like I mentioned, we do have 6 rookies on the grid. This, for some of them, was going to be their first taste at qualifying, and for all of them it was going to be their first qualifying of a full season in Formula One, right? And we did have a couple of shocks, I would say. Now, we have 2 rookies that are starting in, I think, what we'd classify as a top 14. Antonelli in Mercedes and then Lawson in Red Bull. Both of those drivers got knocked out in Q1. With Kimi Antonelli, though, what we did find out after qualifying is that he had actually gone over a curb and it broke the bib of his car, and it meant that he was losing like 3/10 on the straights compared to George Russell. Liam Lawson, I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but he did lose like a lot of running in free practice 3 because of a power unit issue. I think there was either something wrong with the car or he did make a small mistake, but it meant that he ended up getting knocked out. So the 2 rookies I think a lot of people would have thought would make it into Q2 and then eventually Q3 potentially, ended up being knocked out straight away. Ollie Behrman, I mean, he had an absolute mare of a weekend. Sunday was okay for him. Friday, Saturday are not good days at all. On Friday, free practice 1, he had quite a big crash. The car was absolutely wrecked. Free practice 2, they couldn't really get the car ready in time for much running, if any. Free practice 3, he ended up spinning and crashing again, and that meant he had no running there. And then we go into qualifying, and I don't think Haas were really looking at him setting competitive lap times because he hadn't had much time on track anyway. I think they wanted him to get laps in, just exploratory laps, so he'd get used to the track and just set a time. He had an issue with his gearbox the minute he got out on track. They took him back to the garage. I think he was able to drive back around to it, and he just wasn't able to carry on. Issue was too big and that needed to be fixed. So Ollie Behrman also out in Q1. 3 of our 6 rookies were already out. Gabriel Bortoleto, right? And this isn't anything about his driving, but about the style. But he was not a driver I was expecting to make it into Q2. However, he outqualified his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, knocked him out and got himself into Q2, which was amazing. Jack Doohan also into Q2, and Isaac Hadjar in the V-Carb was the quickest of all the rookies in qualifying. He had a phenomenal qualifying. To be fair, for practice runs as well, like over the 3 practice sessions, he was doing so well. Thinking about the Ferraris, and there was Hamilton in particular, he was slowly getting closer to Charles Leclerc, not just throughout qualifying, but also throughout practice. It is a brand new car for him, a brand new engine manufacturer, and he's not a driver that has swapped teams every couple of years, which is absolutely fine, but he's someone that's stuck with Mercedes for such a long part of his career. that there are habits and inbuilt things that he's going to have to relearn slowly. But he was catching up to Charles Leclerc and closing that gap in qualifying. So that was a really good sign. However, right, Ferrari looked like they had such good pace in practice. They looked like they were going to be competitive. They were going to be fighting at the front, potentially fighting for pole. The drivers ended up in P7 and P8. And supposedly they had gone for a wet weather setup, but it just obviously wasn't going to work for quali, which was dry. Who did end up on pole position though? Well, it was a front row lockout for the McLaren boys, Lando Norris in P1 and Oscar Piastri at his home race in P2, and then Max Verstappen was starting behind them. So I think for McLaren, it really felt like they were picking up where they left off last season, getting that front row lockout. And yeah, for Max Verstappen, to be fair, throughout practices, the car didn't look the best. It didn't look the easiest to drive. It didn't always look the quickest. I think they did a lot of work between Friday and Saturday to make those adjustments to the car and make Max a lot happier with it, because yeah, P3 was a very good result in quali when practices didn't always look the most straightforward for them. Let's get into the race breakdown, right? And chatting about what happened right at the top of the field, who was battling for the win, because we don't really have title contenders yet because we're only the first race in. But battling at the front, we're the top three from qualifying. It was Lando, Max and Oscar, and Lando really seemed to be in control of this entire race. Very calm, very collected. There were moments where he did have Oscar or Max behind him trying to battle him for that P1 spot, but he kept his cool and kept his nerve and managed to keep it going. What I will say though is that we did get some random team orders from McLaren to Oscar when Oscar was behind Lando towards the endish of the race, like the second half of the race, right? It was a little bit bizarre, but there were blue flags being waved. I think they were coming across Esteban Ocon, I want to say. And I don't think the team necessarily wanted them battling when they had back markers to overtake. I feel like Oscar lost a little bit of his momentum at that point. He was a lot quicker than Lando before that sort of call got made. And afterwards, when they got told you can fight again, he had lost some of that speed. And I don't know whether that was down to tyre wear or whatever, but he just couldn't catch up after that. It is strange though. Team orders, first race of the season, and if you look at the context of it, I do get it, but just in general, it's not great to hear about it on the very first race of the season. Both of those drivers did have a little bit of an issue towards the end of the race. Even though Lando did relatively have quite a calm and collected race, both of them did end up coming off when we had like this second boost of rain right at the end. Both of them would come off, and Lando had managed to save his car, keep going on track. But for Oscar Piastri, he was beached in the grass for a little bit. It did cause some yellow flags. He had to reverse out, and it did wreck his race. He ended up in P9. But considering he was battling for a podium and for a win, to fall that far back and at his home race, that's the gutting part for me. It was so sad. But there were so many cheers when he managed to reverse out of the grass. And I think we were a little concerned that he was going to have to DNF, because if he couldn't get that car out, there was nothing else they could do. He managed it though, and still managed to get some points. So it's not all bad, and it's a consolation prize, I guess. But to go from battling for a win and being on the podium to being right at the end of the points is really not what you want. Max Verstappen, though, like I said, was also battling for the win at one point. Right at the start, he managed to overtake Oscar Piastri, but there were some complaints about his tyres, and it didn't look like he had the pace of the McLarens. There were points where he looked like he could overtake, but I just don't think he had enough there to get the overtake done. Potentially didn't always feel as comfortable with the wet weather conditions, because you'd rather just keep your car on track. But it did just end up seeming like McLaren had that pace advantage over Red Bull. And that's really not surprising either. McLaren really seemed to have a strong car out in Australia regardless of the conditions. Midfield battles and everything though, and looking what was happening behind them, Alex Albon in the Williams and Nico Hülkenberg doing particularly well, really just racing very fairly, very strong, and getting a really good haul of points for their team. And I think for both of those teams, for Williams and for Kick Sauber, they were teams that finished in P9 and P10 last season. So to get this haul of points early on hopefully it's going to give them, the drivers and the team, a lot of motivation, a lot of push and, momentum to keep fighting for those points. So hopefully for both of the teams, it will be a better sort of season for them compared to last year. I've got my fingers crossed. Like I said, there was a lot going on in this race, weather conditions and all sorts that happened, safety cars and everything. So you don't know how much of this is indicative of their general performance. However, got my fingers crossed that these aren't the last points we're going to see from either of these teams. And I think more with Williams right now than Sauber, but they do seem to have a really strong car. Those two drivers did end up beating out both of the Ferraris. Yeah, not something I thought I was going to be saying. Ferrari had a bit of a disaster class when it came to their strategy, and I don't think anyone's necessarily going to be surprised when I say this, right? That last burst of rain that we had, it was so random. And I say random, it was predicted, right? But, we'd stopped the rain, the drivers had gone onto the slick tyres, and the rain started to come down quite heavily. There was no way you were going to survive it on slicks. It would have been quite difficult, not to mention probably dangerous. And a lot of the teams had gone in for the intermediate tyres. Ferrari opted not to. They kept running until we had a safety car and then had gone in to put on the intermediate tyres with both of their drivers. And because it was a safety car, it just meant that all the cars had already bunched up. And Lewis and Charles ended up at the back of that queue. They'd gone from being all right, being like P5 to P8-ish and probably could have battled for more, especially if they had pitted earlier, to them being in P10 and P9. And it just completely wrecked their race, which was a hard enough race for everyone anyway because of the conditions. But yeah, I mean, the fact that Williams and Sauber have managed to outscore them and finish higher up than them was really not great, and something I really hope that they are looking into in post-race debriefs. Yuki Tsunoda was also someone that kind of suffered from that same strategy. VCARB did the same thing with him, and that was gutting because he was running such a good race up until that point, and then it all fell apart. I don't think even ended up with any points. I mean, at one point he was running in P6, I think, so he would have come away with some lovely points for the team and for himself, and instead walked away with nothing. Esteban Ocon was another driver that struggled and ended up at the back of the field. It wasn't even midfield, it was legitimately at the back. He qualified in like P19, I want to say it was, but could not make any inroads throughout the race. Really, really struggled. So I don't know whether that's a Haas characteristic or whether that's just because setup might not have been great. But yeah, Esteban just couldn't make up those places. And Pierre Gasly was also another driver who had a little bit of a mare of a race. I mean, he was also running really well, and I think it's kind of like Yuki Tsunoda here, where he had a really good race up until a point, and it was towards the second half of the race, towards the end, I think he'd just gone over one of the white lines and the car slid a little bit, and he ended up losing a lot of places because of it. And instead of finishing in the points, he finished in P11. For Alpine, once again, the points would have been amazing, but that little spin, that little mistake ended up meaning that they were out the points. There was a lot going on around all of that, though, and some of these things ended up causing some of the things I've just spoken about. So let's get into those, some of the drama and some of the chaos that's been going on. First up was Isaac Hadjar, who ended up spinning on the formation lap and had a DNS. He couldn't get the car started again. And even if he could have, there was so much damage to the rear wing. I don't think he would have been able to race, really. Way too much work that would have needed to be done to the car. And I was heartbroken for him. He was crying under his helmet, and I was so gutted. He's a rookie driver, and this literally would have been his first F1 race. He's not like Ollie and Liam, who have done F1 races for, and Jack. This is a driver who hasn't done an F1 race at all, and you're probably hyping yourself up a lot before this race. Your first time being able to do a full Grand Prix weekend, your first time as an F1 driver, and to DNS is just gutting. And honestly, the scenes of him being upset, walking away, just broke my heart. But Anthony Hamilton, Lewis's dad, was there to comfort him as he walked back through the paddock, which was just such a sweet and wholesome moment, and I'm sure it meant a lot to Isaac. But yeah, post-race, I think Isaac was just saying that he was a little bit embarrassed and disappointed, but it happens. Let's be honest, this wasn't a straightforward weekend for any of the drivers, let alone the rookies, to have full dry running in practice and then to go into the race and then have it be wet and not be able to really check your wet setup, get used to the intermediate or wet tyres. It was a lot, so I don't think Isaac should be embarrassed. It's just bad luck, and hopefully he can bounce back in China. Jack Doohan was another rookie that actually DNF'd, didn't DNS. He spun on lap 2, had gone over one of the white lines, which are very slippery, spun, and that caused a safety car. Carlos Sainz then ended up spinning during that safety car. He was also DNF. I mean, looking at the rookie drivers, Carlos is a seasoned driver who we have seen is very good at saving the car when he needs to. Kind of has his dad's rally talent there. He can really wrestle the car and save it. So for a seasoned driver like Carlos getting caught out by these things, I don't think any of the rookies should be embarrassed or, beat themselves up too much about what happened. First F1 race in the wet, it's not easy. But yeah, for Jack Doohan, it was his home race that he DNF'd in, his opening race, and on top of that, yeah, for Alpine in general, this was not the best weekend, let's be honest. Alonso, I think, spun, I want to say on lap 24, but it could have been later on. But that did cause another safety car as well, which not great for Alonso. I think at that point, everyone was coming in to start to pit for different tyres, so it is gutting that happened, although it might have been lap 34, actually. Then we had Piastri and Norris having a little bit of a moment on lap 35. They'd kind of come off track. I think the track was a bit too slippery, but it didn't cause a safety car. At least Piastri did just cause some yellow flags because track hazard. But it didn't end there, because lap 47 we saw Gabriel Bortoleto and Liam Lawson spinning and causing a safety car. And it's gutting for them because they were so near towards the end of the race, but that was 4 of our rookies out in the first race. The only 2 that managed to finish the race were Kimi Antonelli and Ollie Behrman. And to be fair, I think Ollie really needed that after the weekend that he had. With Liam Lawson, though, I do just want to mention, so obviously he ended up starting from the pit lane, right, after everything that happened in quali. Red Bull made the decision to start him from the pit lane. Ollie Behrman also started in the pit lane. And also bear in mind, Kimi Antonelli had not started in the best position either. He was like P15, I want to say, is where he started. Lawson was really struggling to make up any places during the race. Now, you'd overtaken both of the Haas's, but that was about it. He couldn't manage to get further through the pack through the entire race. And I think considering where we saw Kimi finish, and that was in P4, and yes, he did benefit from some DNFs, but he drove a very clean race and got some overtakes in as well. I think it's just that stark contrast to Liam Lawson, who is in a Red Bull car, which isn't a terrible car, to not make up those places. Now, I know that Ted had mentioned that I think he had a different front wing to Max Verstappen, which could have caused it. But I'm going to be surprised if it caused that much of a differential that he couldn't get past some of the slower cars on track. So I don't know whether there was an issue with the car or he wanted to play it a little bit safer or what happened, because there was a PU issue beforehand. Maybe that was also contributing to it. But I think he's going to be a little bit disappointed with what has happened, not just the DNF, but the actual race that he ran as well. Let's go into the winners and the losers of this Grand Prix, though. And for the winners, we have Lando Norris, who, he won the Australian Grand Prix. An amazing way to start the season. Now means that he is leading the Drivers' Championship, so he was obviously going to be on the winners list. Drove a good race, and even when he'd come off track and managed to save it, get back on, keep his head and win. Kimi Antonelli is my other winner of the race. I think he just drove a really, really clean race, kept his head down, kept calm. Conditions weren't great, but to end in P4 I think is amazing. He did get a 5-second time penalty for an unsafe release, which Mercedes did appeal after the race, and that got rescinded. He kept P4. And my other winner is Mercedes. As a team, I think they probably were the team that had it the most together this race, right? George Russell finished in P3, Kimi Antonelli finishing in P4. It was a really big points haul for the team. I think they were the most put together team in terms of their results. Everything that happened with Oscar falling to the back of the field, Liam Lawson not being at the front, not being able to get points in DNFing, and then Ferrari strategy, So Mercedes for me are the winners for this race. Losers though, Ferrari are there. I think the strategy really, really messed them up. They could have had a much bigger points haul, and I don't know what happened. I am so curious, but the drivers aren't happy either. They're really not happy with that decision, understandably so. It really costs them places and points. The other loser, I hate to say it, but Oscar Piastri is on the list, and I'm gutted for him, but to go from fighting for a win to fall into the back of the field. He ended up finishing in P9. Like I said, at least it's points, but it's just not where we would have wanted him to be, and definitely not where he thought he was going to end up, or McLaren thought he was going to end up. And my other losers are everyone that didn't finish the race. So that was 6 people, 4 rookies, and then Alonso and Sainz. So our Spanish contingent of F1 drivers. Wow, 6 DNFs in the first race. I've got to feel like it's because testing went way too smoothly this year. We didn't really get red flags for anyone stopping on track. So Australia was like, okay, we'll just bring all of that here instead. That's what I feel like happened. Nobody got it out of their system in testing. Thankfully, though, everyone was safe. I think that's the main thing, especially in rainy, wet conditions, is that all of the drivers came out of it safe. Cars might be damaged, but they are okay. But 6 DNFs, I've got to put those 6 drivers in the losers category because they're all going to be gutted, whether it was your debut race or just your debut for the 2025 season, the first race for this season. It's just not the result that you want to come away with. And for those teams as well, it's a lot of data that they would have lost, a lot of wet weather running data that they would have lost. And yeah, it's not going to be the result any of them wanted. But it was just a super difficult week this week, let's be honest. There was so much that was going on with the rain and then it going dry and then jumping back onto the intermediates and then Ferrari and VCAP deciding we don't want intermediates and then they tuck them. It was messy, guys. That's my point. It was messy. And that dry run up to the weekend didn't help because drivers couldn't get the experience that they needed with the wet weather tyres. The engineers couldn't figure out what setup was going to work best, and it just left us with only 14 drivers finishing the Australian Grand Prix, which is insane to me. It did mean a lot of the rookies got caught out, which is gutting. I mean, I was hoping that they would finish the race, but I did have a gut feeling we were going to see 1 or 2 DNF. I just didn't think it was going to be 4 of them. But I gotta admit, we didn't get as many overtakes in this race, which I'm not surprised at. 1, Albert Park is not always the best place for overtaking, and 2, the wet weather I think was making everyone quite cautious coming off the race line in case they got caught out. But we just didn't get the most overtakes. However, it was still a really interesting race because those safety cars did cause that little bit of risk about when people were going to pit, where they would end up. But yeah, my hat's off to the drivers that managed to finish the race, whether you finished in the points or not, because it wasn't a straightforward race and you managed to keep your cars on track. Next week is the Chinese Grand Prix. We are out in Shanghai and it is a sprint weekend. And considering what we've just seen in Melbourne, guys, I am a little nervous for some of these drivers to only have 1 practice session out in China before we go into sprint qualifying. It's definitely going to be an interesting one. I really like the Shanghai circuit in general. I really, really love the Chinese Grand Prix. But second race of the season, for it to be a sprint race after everything that's just happened in Melbourne is definitely going to be interesting. But we're going to see some teams and drivers really wanting to bounce back from this. It'll give us another really good idea about who is where in terms of the teams, what teams still have that consistent pace and what teams might have been a fluke in Australia, good or bad. I think personally, McLaren aren't a fluke. They are going to be the most consistent team this season. Quite honestly, they're the strongest team, and I can see that happening in China as well. But for Ferrari in particular, I'm very curious what happens there and how they do. But I will be back next week with that Chinese Grand Prix review and seeing what happened there. Sure, it's going to be an interesting one, guys, but thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure to message me or drop me a comment on my TikTok or my Instagram at stewards_office. I'm also on Threads and Blue Sky with the same name, and I will see you guys next time you're summoned to the steward's office.